Okay, hello. Today I want to talk with you about Tsar Paul I. And I have some pictures that I want to show you, so I'm going to try and share the screen. Let's see. And there we go. Okay, so now you're seeing a picture of Paul I. And so Paul is the son of Catherine, and he'd had a odd upbringing. And he was born in 1754, and he was not allowed, or his mother was not allowed to take care of her. Elisabetta was, Catherine was at that moment out of favor with Elisabetta, and even after her birth, the baby was taken away. Catherine was not allowed much access and was her access to Paul was very much curtailed during his early years. In retrospect, that probably contributed to the relationship, the troubled relationship that they had. Not entirely, though, perhaps. He was here's an early portrait of him. So he's born in the fall of 1754. When Elisabetta passes away, he is an 8-year-old. And then just 6 months later, his father will be murdered in a coup that brings his mother to power. And so he is, that's part of his childhood experience. And along the lines of his um, paternity, it remains a question. Was Paul actually the son of Peter III, or was he the child of Sergei Saltykov, Catherine's first lover? And here are pictures of here is the Tsar Peter, here is Saltykov, and here is a picture of Paul. Now, if you ask me, looking at these photos as they've been painted, both Saltykov and Paul share a sort of pug nose that was noted. Simultaneously, however, there are a number of remembrances from the court where people would say that, where people commented on the resemblance between Peter and Paul. This is all quite thin stuff, perhaps. But it's important to, and then as we read in Catherine's memoirs, she hints at Saltykov's paternity, perhaps. And some people have placed a lot of stock in this. The question remains unanswered. I will point out that the historian Paul Wyszkowicz seems quite persuaded that Paul was the child of Saltykov, and he points to kind of health. And he says, look at the Romanov Tsars up to Paul, and we have a fairly unhealthy batch of men, although the women were quite hardy and long-lived. And then following Paul, we have hardy Romanovs, and we don't have problems with the health of the Romanov. So we'll talk about that because Paul will, in many ways, his reign won't be graded as a highly successful reign. It's certainly a short one, but he ends up grandfathering, great grandfathering the rest of the dynasty. So, um, remains an open question. So he grows up and he is a center for people that oppose Catherine at one point, and in large part because many people, um, there was a faction of people, even including Panin, who was Catherine's advisor for much of his career, that Paul should be czar instead of Catherine. And to be sure, Paul had a stronger claim to the throne, and there were suggestions to have a regency. And these suggestions to have a regency or just have Paul be the czar resurfaced as Paul reached his majority around the age of 16, so 54 in like 1770 or so. So one thing to keep in mind is if we know Catherine came to the throne and she is worried about holding on to the throne. It's why we see her make such an effort to learn Russian, identify with Russia, be an observant Orthodox, although she wears her orthodoxy lightly in the Enlightenment mode. But the all that symbolic imagery with the double eagle embroidered on her gowns, for example. She wants to identify with Russia because she recognizes that a threat to her legitimacy on the throne is quite likely. There'd long been this sense that as she, asserts her authority and is doing a good job and doing the work of being empress, that maybe those threats would fall away. Um, at some level, yes, but Paul is a bit of a wild card because of his strong claim to the throne, because he's going to be the successor. Um, and there's some people thinking that he should be the successor sooner than later. Catherine kind of maintains this somewhat threatened sense at some points. There's also the issue that because Catherine was so estranged with Paul, that she might have had ideas to bypass Paul in the succession, and instead of having him become czar, go right to her grandson, Alexander the First, with whom she was quite close and took an active role in his education and had a happier overall relationship with her grandson, Alexander. So all of these remain rumors, but just to keep you abreast of some of the dynamics of this short reign and the years leading up to it. So Paul ends up, as a teenager, he has an affair, and a child is had out of wedlock, who will end up dying in a shipwreck in the Caribbean in 1794 at the young age of 22. And when Catherine learns of this, she makes a decision to get him married, and she does. His first marriage is to a minor princess from a family in the Holy Roman Empire, Princess Wilhelmina of Hesse-Darmstadt. As princesses are, she's christened into Orthodoxy and she's given a new name, Natalia Alexeyevna. Sadly, they have their first child almost 3 years after being married, and both she and the child die in childbirth in 1776, actually April 15th. So just 250 years ago today, April 15th, is when she passed away. Catherine arranges a second marriage, and that marriage is to the Duchess, again, drawing from Germanic lands, Duchess Sophie Dorothea of Wittenberg. She is christened into Orthodoxy and takes on the name Maria Fyodorovna. And um, she will be the mother of subsequent czars. They are married in 1776. She has 10 children, 9 live to adulthood, 2 will become czars. And this marriage, for whatever criticisms we might give of Paul as a czar, the marriage is quite successful. And they are actually sent away from court and raise their family at the Palace of Gatchina. Peter III had liked going there, and here's an aerial picture of Gatchina. You see this great big courtyard where both Peter III and then Paul II could drill soldiers, which they enjoyed military parades greatly. So Paul followed his father in that step, as well as in his admiration of all things Prussian. But that's where they raised their family. And here's another picture of Maria Fyodorovna. She was purported to be a beauty of the age, and their 10 children indicates a happy marriage. It doesn't mean Paul didn't have mistresses on the side. He did, but the marriage is deemed as quite a success. And here is a picture of the whole family. With the future Tsar Alexander the First here in the guard uniform of the Semyonovsky regiment, and he's next to his brother Konstantin, the next born brother, who we'll talk about when we talk about the ascension of Nicholas. But spoiler, he bypassed, he forewent the being successor to the throne. He also had a morganatic marriage to a Catholic Pole that disqualified him. But even before that, he wasn't gonna be czar, and so the succession was going to pass if Alexander didn't have children. No one really knew what was going to happen, but he ended up dying without issue. And so here is a picture of Nicholas, who will end up being czar afterwards. But here is the whole family. Uh, Quick list of, this is so from Paul to the end. It goes Paul, then Alexander the First, the son of Paul, and then Nicholas the First, the brother of Alexander the First, and the son of Paul. And then Alexander the Second is the son of Nicholas the First. Alexander the Third is the son of Alexander the Second, and Nicholas the Second is the son of Alexander the Third. So there you see a pretty much straight up primogeniture passing of the guard. Now, so back to 1796, Catherine somewhat unexpectedly has a stroke, and Paul becomes the emperor. What are some of the first things he does? The very first thing, one of the very first things he does is have his father, Peter the Third, exhumed to be reinterred alongside Catherine the Second at Peter and Paul Fortress. Here's a picture of Peter and Paul Fortress across the Neva River from the Winter Palace. And here is a print done near to the time of the two coffins of Catherine and Peter III right next to each other. Catherine probably wouldn't have chose to lie for all eternity next to her first husband, her husband Peter III, and Paul was probably aware of that in imposing that choice on her. Here's another image from the late 18th century, an engraving reproducing that picture of the the kind of exhumed and reinterred Peter III alongside the recently deceased Catherine II. They have something of a double funeral. And also, he wants to reverse his things. If you'll recall, Nikolai Novikov had been punished and sentenced to the Schlusselburg prison. He's released, as is Alexander Radishchev, who had been sent to Siberia. He is called back in, and so Paul is explicitly doing things to kind of reverse his mother's agenda and intentions. And it almost lends some credence to the notion that Catherine had the idea of bypassing him because of what she saw as his, dispositions and intentions. Now, the another thing Paul does quite early in his new reign is he passes fundamental laws that spell out the rules regarding the royal family and the upkeep of the royal family. What the creates a department to give them all allowances and be really clear about titles, and also sets a rule of succession explicitly intended to exclude women. That the succession will pass through the men. If there is no male heir, it will go to the first male of the surviving female, and only in the event that there is no dynastic male heir can a female take the throne. That is preferable, as set out in Paul's fundamental laws, to the throne passing to a different dynastic figure. For example, even a woman, the husband of a woman from the dynastic line cannot take the throne according to these rules. But so Paul wants to make sure that the way his mother came to the throne and ruled and that a woman ruling won't happen again. And after this, for the duration of the Russian Empire, it does not happen. Remember, on the eve of a century in which women had been on the throne for the majority of that center. So that is, one legacy of Paul. Paul, like his father, he very much enjoyed drilling sergeants, drilling and the exercise of drilling and commanding soldiers and having military parades. He would force people to watch military parades, and he and so in some ways people say like father, like son. I do want to point out, however, that there is a revisionist body of work emerging on Paul that's saying, let's give him another look. He did have ideas and morality that he was quite committed to. For one thing, he wanted to kind of reform the court. He thought that under his mother, there'd been too much licentiousness and that the nobility had gotten kind of too lazy and too lazy and free. And he wanted to return a sort of more conservative ethos to the fort the court rather. He complained about wild spending and profligate ways, but he himself, in fact, did nothing to actually reduce this. He just spent money in other ways. Um, he Part of this revisionist school are those that would say, that Catherine maybe was a bit hard on him. And that, for example, he's healthy and present, and she wants to potentially might have had ideas to exclude him from the throne. So we will see um, where things land in the end. But certainly he gives a conservative imprint to the Romanov dynasty going forward that I think we can see throughout the 19th century. He also wanted to, if Catherine had kind of followed through in a bit of an irony, if he wanted to undo things Catherine did and honor his father, Peter III had kind of freed the nobility from being absolutely bound to court service, and Catherine hadn't really backed off that. Paul tries to impose requirements for the nobility to serve the state, kind of bring things back to serving the nobility. Um, but like his father, in foreign policy, he displayed some major departures. And I won't go into the too much into the complicated continental politics of the time, but Catherine had sent an army towards Central Asia. He recalled that army, only to a couple years later announce intentions to send an army into India. He made he declared that he didn't want to be involved in a lot of military entanglements, and yet, he recalled he recalled an army that Catherine had dispatched towards Central Asia, only to turn around and send an army into the Dolomites of Italy to fight against French armies in support of Austria. He also got quite upset when the French and then the British took the island of Malta in the Mediterranean. What does anyone have to do with Malta? Well, this is a little bit of a rabbit hole, but Paul had been kind of awarded a title of a guardian of some sort of the Knights Hospitaller, this kind of medieval order of knights that was based on the island of Malta in the Mediterranean, even though they were Catholic and Paul is Orthodox. But he was quite honored by this, and so he was quite miffed at the move to harm or usurp the Maltese knights. And so he had a great affection the for Malta, and it is even the reason why St. Michael's Palace, where he would move shortly before his death, was painted this red color, the kind of colors of the order that he was so honored to be an honorary member of. Um, so Paul's ways did much to offend high-ranking military figures and nobles close to the court. And uh, he is the leader, unconstrained by a constitution, unconstrained by a legislature. This is autocracy. And yet, his erratic and disrespectful, his erratic foreign policy moves, his disrespectful behavior toward many high-ranking people in the nobility resulted in him not lasting either. And a conspiracy was formed to overthrow him. 68 nobles were involved in the 68 nobles were involved in this conspiracy to overthrow him. He had yeah, well, yeah, let me just suffice it to keep things general and say that many of his foreign policy moves, breaking off relations with Britain, and then suddenly breaking off with Austria, and then recommencing relations with Austria, maybe um, being too friendly with France and then not being friendly with France, this sort of just erratic behavior, there wasn't a high degree of tolerance for it. And so it contributed to the move to overthrow him. He was, and I want to read for you just a little bit from Lindsay Hughes's The Romanovs about the ousting of Paul. She writes, so Paul has Mikhailovsky Palace in St. Petersburg built. It's in here that he would be murdered. And in fact, Paul only lived in his house for 38 days in the new century before his reign was cut short by assassination. The initiators of the plot, among them were Count Nikita Petrovich Panin and others. Certain things delayed the overthrowing. They already like planned that they would do this, but it got a little bit delayed. And in all, 68 members of the elite were involved in this conspiracy. It was a homogenous group drawn from the highest layer of Russian society. They agreed that Paul was not good for them and that it wasn't good for the Russian Empire as well. And so, how did it happen? On March 11th, 1801, conspirators broke into Paul's bedchamber to place him under arrest. There was a scuffle, and one of the conspirators drew a sword. Paul shouted out, "What have I done to you?" And the answer came, "You have tortured us for 4 years," according to Bennigsen's memoir. And moments later, he was dead. And it is probably the conspirator Nikolai Zubov struck him over the head with a heavy snuff box. He fell, and then a number of other conspirators fell on him. It was a collective murder where no one person, no one finger could be pointed at one individual who administered the fatal blow. The guilt was collective. They then went elsewhere in the building to wake up Alexander, Paul's son, and they woke him up and told him that he was now the emperor. Alexander was distressed. He knew about the conspiracy to overthrow his father. He hadn't acquiesced in his murder, and yet, as with Catherine's plausible deniability over Peter III's fate, it was how would his how would this succession work with Paul still alive is a question a realist needs to ask. Um, Nonetheless, as his wife would later write, his sensitive soul will remain tortured by it forever. And it does indeed seem that that was the case. If the murder of Paul brought instant relief to the political elite, it didn't have the same effect on his son. He, and understandably, he was quite scared in his early years. And after all, Russia had this, at this point, a substantial tradition of rebellion and violent regime changes in the last century plus. And so he was concerned that that might await him too. He was quite concerned not to offend the powerful personnel at court or in the armed forces. Um, and his fears may have deterred him from articulating any real plan of political action or reform other than vague promises to rule in the manner of his grandmother, whom most nobles remembered quite fondly um, because she had protected their interest. Recall, if she would have liked to maybe eliminate serfdom, she doesn't do that. And she keeps the nobles happy. So, in a similar way, Catherine had seen Alexander educated in a way that he had by reformists with modern progressive ideas. And so he came to the throne with intentions as liberator, but on some was a disappointment to the kind of progressive spectrum of the time. And with that, we will end Paul's ruler, a kind of a ruler who didn't last long because of his rudeness, his erratic foreign policy. He was murdered at the age of 47 years old. All right, that's all.